in May. Welcome to the Nature-Based Coastal Solutions Pacific Chapter's 4th webinar. And before we introduce today's speaker, we have 2 quick housekeeping items. We've got first a plug for our upcoming workshop and also a super quick poll. It's only 4 questions. It'll take just a couple minutes. And also on this slide, if you're not yet on our mailing list, you can sign up using this link. And Jess can also paste it into the chat. I bet she's doing that right now. Okay, so first,
I'm on it, slow, but on it.
I figured you would be. Okay, so first housekeeping update is a reminder that our very first workshop is planned for October 8th to 10th at the WASC Center in downtown Vancouver. It aims to unite professionals, researchers, advocates from diverse backgrounds to foster collaboration, learning, and advocacy for nature-based coastal solutions in the Pacific region. Topics for discussion and workshopping are expected to be cross-disciplinary, ranging from coastal zone management, best design practices, monitoring, communication of risks, and perspectives of rights holders and stakeholders. And here is an overview of the workshop schedule. The first day will be a field trip visiting some nature-based coastal projects around Burrard Inlet. And then we'll have 2 days of talks with a social on the evening of October 9th. We have extended our abstract submission deadline, which was originally today, now set to June 7th. So you have another couple weeks to get that abstract in. Thanks to those of you who have already got your abstract submitted. I think we have about 10 submitted at this point. Okay. Next item of business is a very short poll. We just have 4 questions for you. And you can access our poll using either this QR code or go to menti.com and enter that code. Jess is also putting a link to it in the chat, and she's also going to steal the screen so that we can show the results. So the questions are, first, what is your background or area of expertise? There's multiple choices. Second, what type of organization do you work for or with right now? Also, have you submitted an abstract to the workshop yet? And finally, this is an open question, the last one. What topics would you like to see covered in future webinars? Okay, Jess, I'll hand it to you.
Thanks very much. Can you see that?
Yep.
Great. We already have lots of responses coming in, so I think we'll just give another 15 seconds or so. A lot of coastal engineers, unsurprisingly.
Where's the biologists?
A couple more seconds there. And some of you might recognize this poll if you joined our community practice early. This is a repeat of one of the polls that we did early on our first webinar. So we're just trying to get a feel for how our community practice is changing over time. Okay, there's almost 30 responses. I can see 53 people in the webinar, so I'll wait a little bit longer in case anybody was struggling to come in. Okay.
Anyone having any issues accessing this? You can pop a question in the chat if you're having trouble.
Okay, I'm going to move to the next one. So what type of organization are you affiliated with this? Academic, consultant, government, NGO, or other? Some of you might have a mix in there, so just try and pick whichever one kind of fits your organization the most. Happy to see we have a lot of people from government here. I think that's a bit of a shift from our early poll as well. And looks like we got 32 people in, 33. Give 5 more seconds. Okay, and I will move along here. The next one, this is very dear and close to my heart because I'm helping to plan this. So have you registered for the Pacific Workshop in October?
Or at least have you submitted an abstract yet? We haven't quite opened registration yet.
Yes, I should say you can't actually register yet. So if anybody puts in that they registered, that would be surprising. But I think yes is the planning to attend. Confirm that you're planning to attend. A couple more seconds. Got about maybe just over a third that's not able to attend this time around. A lot of unsures still. If you need any convincing, feel free to give me pop a comment in the chat. And a whole bunch of people that are already planning to go or already convinced. And then the last one, this is a word cloud. So please just pop in the chat. We're just interested to hear if there's any future webinar topics that you are interested in learning about. We've had a quite wide range of topics so far with our 4 webinars, and we're planning to cover a lot of different topics in the workshop in the fall, ranging from, policy to more coastal engineering, all the way through case studies and that kind of thing as well. But if there's anything specific for future webinars, I think we'll be looking to have one probably at the end of the fall, early winter again as well, after having a small break for the summer. And if you like any of the words you're seeing on the screen, if you type in the exact same thing, it'll make it big and bold and help to highlight if other people think the same as you. Seeing a couple ice ones, which is really interesting because we haven't had any topics on that as well. Cold environments, coastal restoration.
Regulatory hurdles, yes.
Regulatory hurdles, that's coming up. Volunteering, design, regulation. Sounds like we probably need a regulation one coming up here. And
that will definitely be discussed at the workshop.
Yes, quite heavily. And I should say with the ice one as well, we do have an Arctic chapter of the Community of Practice. And I think we haven't been particularly great at sharing the links to those webinars, but we'll try and get a little bit better at it because I know they are talking about ice a little bit more than us as well. Fantastic. I will leave this open so we can keep gathering responses if you want to, but I'll let Becca and Jessica take over from me here.
Okay, one more slide from me. So, can you guys see that? Okay, so on to our main event for today. So that's good, about 8 minutes in. Hopefully everyone who wants to see this is here. We are recording this, by the way. So if you want to forward the recording on to someone who missed the event, then you can do that. Okay, so we're very excited to introduce Jessica Côté, a Principal Coastal Engineer with more than 20 years of consulting experience, working on complex coastal issues across the US and around the world. And the title of Jessica's talk today is Nature-Based Design to Reduce Coastal Erosion and Flooding in Washington. And Jessica, I will stop sharing and you can start sharing.
Great, thank you. You can hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for attending today. I'm excited to be here. I have a lot of colleagues in Canada, given that I used to work at Golder Associates, so see some familiar names and faces. I'm just going to start off by acknowledging my team. So I founded Blue Coast in 2018, but the projects that I'm going to be talking about, I am not alone on working on. So we're now a company of 9 people. Our newest member, Vero, joined us just a couple months ago. And just a shout out to my business partner, Kathy Ketteridge, the other principal here at Blue Coast. I am a coastal engineer. I'm also a geomorphologist. And I do we really focus on restoration. That is our primary focus and what we love to do the most. We do a lot of other traditional coastal engineering as well. Kathy does a little bit more of that in terms of the coastal structures, and she's more the numerical modeling arm of our team. So that's us. So probably doesn't come as a surprise to many of you, but the majority of Puget Sound shorelines are armored in one way or another. Down here, they call them bulkheads. I tell people this all the time. That is not a technical coastal engineering term. Puget Sound likes to think that they're very special, and we make up these special terms to go with our special shorelines. But we as engineers did the best we could with the information we had available at the time, but we certainly learned and know better now. So really trying to work to reduce that armoring. One of my other most favorite types of shore farms and habitats to really spend time in are what they call pocket estuaries down here. Obviously, Puget Sound is an estuary in itself. So smaller estuaries within Puget Sound that have been filled or impaired. About 40% of these very low-lying areas, very easy to fill and develop. This one has a culvert, so it still has tidal inundation, but there's a lot of them that have no tidal inundation any longer, which I'll talk a little bit about. Why do we care? Why do we do this? Well, Pacific sand lance is one of the reasons, as well as surf smelt, which spawn on the upper intertidal beach. And so these forage fish are an important food source for a number of other fish and kind of at the base of our food chain. And of course, the Chinook salmon is one of the primary reasons that a lot of the work that we do actually gets funded, as well as the resident killer whales also. So because of these keystone species that are threatened or endangered, that's part of the funding mechanism for us to do a lot of the restoration that we do in Puget Sound, although it benefits many, many other species. Many of you may be aware of this, but I also teach a lot of these classes, like the class called Alternatives to Bulkheads through the Coastal Training Program, and I do workshops for homeowners. And so I just like to get us all on the same page on if we're talking about intertidal zone, what are we talking about? Or if we're talking about nearshore, what are we talking about? From the coastal engineer and geomorphologist, we're often talking about that back shore, the back beach area, down to the low tide terrace, but not out as far as maybe an ecologist or a biologist might consider, because they're usually talking about also the submerged aquatic vegetation, right? All the way out into the photic zone. They are all very connected, but our work, we typically are not physically working in those lower zones unless it's like a dredging project. But when we're talking about nature-based design, that's not usually what we're talking about. But we have our feeder bluffs, and our feeder bluffs discharging sediment to the nearshore intertidal beach, also providing wood. All of these are connected to our small streams, which are also important habitat for juvenile salmon, juvenile fish particularly. And then we have lower banked, lower beaches with riparian vegetation providing shade. So all of these habitats are very important, and we don't ever just look at what's directly in front of us when we're looking at a particular project. We like to look up and down the shoreline, updrift, downdrift, and really comprehensively to understand how we can affect not only what's going on right at the site that we're working, but also the bigger picture. Interesting that regulations was brought up, because I'm going to talk a little bit about our Washington regulations, which I know from speaking with Jess and Becca and Vero and other folks that work in Canada, they're quite different than they are up in Canada. There's been a lot of pretty stringent regulations placed in the recent years on shoreline development. And most of these come through our State Shoreline Management Act, which is then actually implemented at a local level. So either at cities or counties, depending on the local jurisdiction. And what this Shoreline Management Act says is that the first thing you need to do is to avoid impacts on the shoreline. And this is within, I should say, within 200 feet of the ordinary high water mark, which is a jurisdictional boundary. It's about mean high water most of the time. Our federal boundary down here is what they call the high tide line, which is about the highest astronomical tide. So avoid first. If you can't avoid, then you have to minimize. You need to choose the least impactful alternative for anything that you're doing on the shoreline. And then if you can't minimize, then you need to compensate. But for any of these actions other than avoid, you have to actually demonstrate need and really clearly demonstrate need. And this is pretty new. This is also being upheld by our Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And you really have to demonstrate that the home or whatever it is on the parcel that you're working on is going to be at risk in the very near future in order to get a permit for any kind of structure for shore. But even for soft shore, you still have to demonstrate that there's really need for stabilizing that shoreline and that you can't just allow natural processes to continue. So we work in this space a lot. This demonstration of need is a big part of what we do. And then we also work in the space of using the soft shore, the habitat friendly design and construction. So then a little bit more about sort of how this plays out. So the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has taken this and sort of created their own set of numerical order of guidelines that they recommend that you follow. So the first one is, can you remove any existing shoreline stabilization structures and actually restore beaches? So this is Coronet Bay up north. If any of you are coming from Vancouver down south near Deception Pass State Park, and they removed this bulkhead and put in beach nourishment and large wood to restore the shoreline. So just an example of what that looks like. If you can't restore, and if you're trying to demonstrate need, you need to demonstrate that it's not an upland slopes instability issue. If it's a geologic issue, or if it's an issue being caused by drainage from the upland flowing towards the shoreline, you also will not get a permit for anything on the shore, even soft shore most of the time. So this is, again, just part of that's not a process that's going to be affected or controlled. Could be mitigated by soft shore, but it's a gray area. And then you need to protect, enhance, and replace native vegetation. So if you've controlled drainage, and the next thing that they really encourage everyone to look at is vegetation, which is a really important part of what we do. And then, can you relocate buildings or improvements or whatever it is that you're proposing to do? Can you set it back further from the shoreline and move it out of harm's way, as opposed to trying to protect it in place? And then finally, after all of that, is when you would come in their sort of flow diagram to the ability to be able to construct a soft shore if you can demonstrate that there's need for it. This particular project, Kathy Ketteridge was the lead engineer on, and they placed dredge material. So it's actually a little bit finer than what the natural substrate would be there. And I'll talk a little bit more as I go about the requirements from not only recommendations, but really requirements from particularly Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. I'm going to call WDFW from here on out. I'm trying to be good about defining my acronyms because most of you don't know them probably, but WDFW really dictates oftentimes what kind of sediment grain size we can place on a beach in a soft shore project. And then if you're looking at constructing a hard structure, they're going to first ask you if you can construct it landward of that ordinary high water mark or landward of the high tide line. Particularly the landward of the high tide line, you're then out of the federal jurisdiction, which makes your life a whole lot easier. But I would say that, if you're really looking at putting in a structure, it's probably pretty unlikely that you're above those demarcations, because if you really need to demonstrate need, then you probably don't have a lot of space between whatever it is that you're trying to protect and those particular water lines. So some projects are easy. This is a residential armor removal that we designed, and we have a series of conservation districts so every county has a conservation district in Washington state. They're one of our primary sponsors for trying to do hard armor removal. We also have a series of fisheries enhancement groups that cover all of the areas within Puget Sound. So a lot of our non-for-profit organizations are often leading the work to get the grants and identify projects. So this is an old dilapidated bulkhead that somebody constructed on their own. It's got gabion cages filled with these concrete plugs and a bunch of cobble. There is a home that used to be on top of this slope, and the neighbor actually bought the property and removed the home with the interest of conserving the beach and the shoreline. And so we went in and removed it and augmented that cobble that was in the cages that got placed on the beach with some finer grain sediment. Vegetation work still has to happen here. They're going to be removing, there's a lot of invasive vegetation here. They'll be slowly removing that and replanting it with native vegetation. Some projects are really hard. They have lots of constraints and lots of other things to consider, and maybe full restoration isn't an option. And I'll talk more about this project in a little bit. So shoreline armor removal, so more like linear shoreline armor removal are generally the easier types of projects that we do when estuaries are much more challenging, have a lot more infrastructure and things to consider. We have a fairly standard process here in Puget Sound that we follow a feasibility and conceptual design phase, and then we go into what they call preliminary design, and then final design and construction. And a lot of that nomenclature is really defined by the grant agencies, which is primarily through Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, administer many grants for the local work. And then they usually people also have a federal match in order to fully fund projects. But so through that process, we first start just by looking at what is the habitat around us that we're trying to improve or that we are trying to protect. Again, on the upper intertidal, it's often forage fish, but it also could be other migrating fish species that are migrating along the shoreline. Or it could be, eelgrass. For example, there's been few studies and sites where we've seen that scour at the base of a bulkhead has eroded finer grain sediments. They've been deposited out in the eelgrass beds, and the eelgrass beds have declined over time, for example. So this is also in Deception Pass State Park. Coronet Bay is down on the bottom over here that I showed you a photo of, and this is out on a point here. So this was a Blue Coast project that we designed and was constructed. It's an old ferry terminal. So it was a ferry landing, and then this was a portion maybe of a dolphin or something that the dock structure that connected to the ferry landing. So inventorying structures and utilities, measuring topography, identifying the water levels, so extreme water levels, daily water levels, sea level rise scenarios as well, looking at wind wave climate. For the most part in Puget Sound, we have a fairly gentle wind wave climate. We are fetch limited, depth limited, and often we have skinny fetches as well. So all of those things really limit the wind wave development and wave growth. I know that up in the Vancouver area, you certainly have some areas that have much more significant wave climate, more like in the Straits of Juan de Fuca here, but we don't tend to do as much work out there. And then determine erosion rates, which is often one of the biggest challenges because there's usually just not very much data. When I go into these projects, one of the very first things that I suggest is like, you should start collecting some beach profiles or some drone or anything you can to get some survey of the beach so that we can start to determine erosion rates, because none of these projects, even the easiest ones, take fewer than 3 years from the beginning of feasibility to actual construction, just based on fish windows, permitting time, acquiring the grants for it, all those sorts of things. They don't, when they go in for grants, they often want to do feasibility conceptual design. So kind of keeping the budgets smaller. We don't usually do things like geotechnical engineering until like preliminary or even final design, again, to keep the budgets smaller until they've really determined, yes, this project's going to be worthwhile and it's really going to compete well in later grant rounds for construction. So then we look at the coastal geomorphology, not necessarily at, kind of all at the same time. Where does it sit within the drift cell? What type of shore form is it mapped at? You know, on the ground, we're looking at that as well as from the bigger picture. But again, going back to what I said about that big picture, right? So we want to make sure we're working in the context of the surrounding area. Do we have sediment supply? So if we do restoration here, we're really focused on restoring process and making sure that that process is going to be supported by the other surrounding land use. So if it's, you know, structure removal and it's just surrounded by structures everywhere else, including like impounding sediment behind structures on feeder bluffs, then it's not a great project opportunity at this time usually. So we're really looking for places that can have longer stretches either of armor removal, or they don't have a lot of armor in other portions of the drift cell itself. We identify the constraints and opportunities usually pretty early on. This particular site had a buried fiber optic cable, which nobody really thought about or had any idea until we went out and we saw this giant sign. Turns out it goes to the Navy base. So that's a pretty important fiber optic cable. Happens to run right underneath that structure in the vicinity. So it didn't stop us from being able to do the work, but we certainly, you know, took a slightly more cautious approach. Knowing that that was there. Otherwise, it's a recreational area. It's a state park. We almost always look for reference sites, whether we're doing an armor removal or we're doing an estuary restoration project. Reference sites are key. This particular site is in a transition zone between the beach being a accretionary shore form and a transport. So it's in a transport and then it becomes accretionary just on the other side. So a little bit more complex in terms of just the dynamics and the geomorphology. So really taking into consideration all of the beaches around it in order to understand what kind of material might stay put there or how quickly will it move. So remove the armor rock and asphalt. Obviously, that's like the primary portion of the project. We typically work with a couple of different landscape architects who help us with our planting plans and sometimes with the placement of wood. In this particular project, we buried some large wood and it's not anchored. We don't anchor wood typically in Puget Sound. It's really deterred because it just creates a scour hole oftentimes and the chains become loose and it's a lot of maintenance. There's a few exceptions, but for the most part, we do not anchor wood. These buried logs were also actually meant to be a visual indicator because they're over the top of where that fiber optic cable is. And this is, like I said, it's a state park and they don't spend a lot of time going out there monitoring, and there isn't a requirement for them to do physical monitoring on a regular basis, although the project sponsor, Northwest Straits Foundation, does do some monitoring. But it was important that there was some indication of, yes, like you've lost a lot of material from here. It's eroded faster than we expected. And so you're seeing 2 of the 3 buried logs. You need to be aware of that and thoughtful and probably place more sediment. So we often will place a little bit more material than what we think we need for it to be stable, so that it gives the beach something to work with, gives the wave forces, coastal processes something to work with and to move around. So this is post-restoration, just post-restoration. We got little baby plantings there. We didn't place a whole lot of wood here. It did actually recruit some wood. So this is a little bit later. The eelgrass didn't do very well. This was a little bit late in the season for it. They've gone back and planted more. But overall, a really successful project. And I said I would mention a little bit about sediment placement. So this was a 2.5 inch minus they call it a fish mix here in Puget Sound. It's a pretty standard composition of beach material. The biggest thing is when we look at it, when it comes in as the deliverable from the contractors, is we're looking to make sure it has enough sand. They often it will have not as much sand fraction as we really like. So there's a range of gradations even within that 2.5 inch fish mix that you can get depending on the quarry that it's coming from. So we look at it pretty closely in terms of making sure it has sufficient sand fraction, because if it's too coarse, then it's not going to provide the habitat for the forage fish that we're looking for. This would be surf smelt spawning beach. So I mentioned, Little Squalicum Beach, more challenging project for sure. So this is Port of Bellingham land, and it has a parking area, and people do access the shoreline. So at least some of that parking area needed to be maintained. There's actually a oil tank right here in these trees that also, or it might be propane. I could be wrong about that. I think it's propane, right here in the trees that also needed to be maintained, and obviously a bunch of infrastructure up here. So not an opportunity for full restoration, but they really wanted to make some significant improvements. And this is not, it looks like it might be a riprap revetment, but it's actually just concrete rubble. And we see, those sort of messy structures, old messy structures, pretty common in Puget Sound. So looking to nature, crenulate shorelines are a known shore form in the natural world, adjacent to a rocky headland in this case, but you can also use a revetment as a rocky headland or as a hard point in which to build a crenulate shoreline shape. There's pretty accessible equations in order to be able to calculate what the actual equilibrium shoreline would look like. So we did that and implemented it here. And this is immediately post-construction. So you can see we shortened we removed all of the concrete and disposed of it. And then we actually replaced it with a properly built revetment with filter rock and the correct gradation and placement. But it is much shorter. There's a lot more beach here. And we did overbuild this beach as well. We did that intentionally because in case our calculations were not exactly right, we did want nature to be able to reshape this to the crenulate shape, the equilibrium crenulate shape that it wanted to be. This also, there'll be lots more plantings up here, but they just were not done yet in this photo. And we did reconfigure the parking lot as well. So this is what it looked like before, pretty awful. And the photo on the left is actually, you can see the construction equipment in the background. So it was just getting finished, at least this portion of the beach. And on the right is after a couple of storm events, and definitely was starting to adjust. And then after a few more storm events, you can see that there's actually a scarp forming, which we generally try to avoid scarps forming just because it alarms people. It indicates to people a lot of times that there's something wrong. It may just be, the beach adjusting. But one thing we did find on this project is that the contractor probably overly compacted the material. And so that's why it's been able to hold that slope. It's a question we get from contractors a lot actually on projects, is like, well, you don't have any spec for compaction in here. And we said, well, no, we don't want you to compact it. We want you to place the material and then, let it essentially weather in place. Because otherwise this is basically what happens, right? So it doesn't act as much like a natural beach. It's difficult to control that level of compaction. But overall, the project's actually performed quite well. Some of the material has certainly, moved, and that was exactly as we expected it to. So I'm going to move on a little bit to flood risks and reduction, and I'm going to kind of flow into estuaries here. So this is Point No Point Park, County Park, which is on the Kitsap Peninsula, northern end of the Kitsap Peninsula in Puget Sound. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the December 27, 2022 extreme water level event where we had the low pressure and the king tide and some wind wave energy, depending on what orientation you were facing. We also in November 2022 actually had like a 25-year wind wave event out of the north, and this is a northerly facing shoreline. So north is pointing up on this particular image. So this beach was overtopped and it flooded the road. There was also water coming from the backside. You can see in the lower portion of the image, which I'll talk about in a moment. They had basically 30 inches of water on the road. Many of these homes were surrounded by water. People couldn't get their cars out. Lots of damage. And then once it was overtopped and there was just so much water that it actually carved out a tidal channel. And so the tidal exchange was allowed to come all the way up onto the road and back out to the shoreline after this happened. Well, there's a very good reason why this happened at this shoreline. And that's because it used to be a historic barrier embayment. It's very low, and the area of that breach, hopefully you can see my pointer. Actually, here, let me turn on my little laser pointer. So the beach that I was just showing an image of is up here. And so one thing that you'll notice is that the historic shoreline in this location was actually quite a bit landward of where that current shoreline is trying to be held in place. And there was a lighthouse. This is the first lighthouse in Puget Sound. This is also a very important cultural site. There was a significant treaty signed here. So there's a lot going on at this site, but former barrier spits, primary tidal channel here, and lots of interior tidal channels and salt marsh is what it looked like historically. This shoreline also, right, historic shoreline, is significantly landward of where it was landward prior to now, obviously. So this just gives you a little bit more context. So there was a lighthouse that was built, several other structures, and then a road put in. And during all of this, they filled all of these wetlands. They're all freshwater wetlands now. There's a single ditch with a tide gate and an 18-inch outfall. We estimate that there used to be the primary tidal channel was like 100 feet wide. Excuse me. And now we have an 18-inch outfall draining this system that used to be drained by a 100-foot wide tidal channel. There's a stream coming down into the upper wetland. It's being blocked in terms of discharge into the larger wetland by a private road. It says 12-inch culvert, but that's essentially blocked. There are feeder bluffs and a lot of sediment supply to this beach, and the eastern shoreline is actually very natural and quite beautiful. So we estimated that during those particular events, about 35% of the water was coming over the northern shoreline, about 35% was coming over the eastern shoreline, and another 30% was coming from precipitation. So from that upper watershed down. And so essentially the entire marsh fills up. There's no place for the water to go because at high tide, that tide gate is closed. And so it's only open for very short windows of time through that tiny 18-inch pipe. And then with all the water coming over the northern shoreline through that park, the easiest path for it to get out was, excuse me, was across the northern shoreline. And so then it had bidirectional flow essentially going there. So the county went in and did an emergency placement of super sacks in order to stop the tides from washing across the road and then pump the water out. But they really needed a better solution than that. This site is one that we had been working at. We had that big model that I just showed because we had actually been working at this site looking at the historic barrier embayment for estuary restoration with one of our fisheries enhancement groups. So we've been working here for a number of years already trying to work towards that goal. So we were not that surprised when this happened. The other thing is that there is a parking area, and this is just what they call a curb wall. So it's basically just a parking curb, essentially sitting on the sand with no footing or anything, that was being undermined and was probably going to fail relatively soon after all of that erosion. And there's a U.S. Coast Guard tower behind it. And then this is a historic building too. So we proposed to come in, and this is what the beach looked like before the 2022 event. So to take this beach and raise the grade by about 3 feet and add vegetation to essentially create a foredune. These aren't typically seen a lot in Puget Sound because most of our beaches aren't sandy. And we also just don't have that kind of beach width for this system to develop. They're very common out on the Washington coast. So we basically pitched this idea to the permitting agencies, and they said, well, that is not truly just soft shore, and you're really significantly altering the potential habitat. And so this is what they would call an individual permit, as opposed to like most restoration is what we call streamlined permitting. And it's, we can get a permit in sort of 3 to 6 months. This is more like 9 months to a year. And the county has super sacks in place, the park is closed, and they're very concerned about entering another winter. So in the short term, the agency said you can raise it back up to what it was prior to the storm events. So that's what we did. So the image on the right is just showing sand. This is a sand land spawning beach, so we had to use that medium to find sand. We did fill the lower portion of the channel that had created with a little bit of a coarser material so that if we do get some erosion, it doesn't just blow through that channel again. But basically that's all they would allow us to do in a quick time frame. We actually did it under an emergency declaration so that we could get it constructed last winter. And luckily we didn't get any really extreme water level events. And just as an analog, I wanted to show you on the left here, that is the eastern shoreline. So you can see very natural, tons of vegetation. It actually fared very, very well in the storm events. It is facing a different direction, but it was still exposed to still the same high water levels. And it had a little bit of, it certainly had some overwash, but it didn't have these major breaches. And a lot of that's because of the extensive vegetation and the wood that exists over there. So this is just showing you that northern shoreline. And one of the other major pieces of this was that we are going to restrict access. We're working on getting the permits right now to be able to construct this during our fish windows this fall and winter. But previously, people walked just all the way across the whole area of the beach. And so the vegetation that would try to colonize just never really had a fighting chance. So we'll be restricting access to a single location after we put the project in place with the higher elevation and lots of vegetating this entire area to try to get it to be a little bit more stable. We're also rebuilding the curb wall into more of a seawall and building the revetment. Now, one of the reasons we're going to take out the whole revetment and replace it. And up until about 1.5 years ago, this project would be what we call self-mitigating. Maybe it's been a year, which means that if we were just asking to do this structure in itself, they would require us to do mitigation for the impacts even if we are putting it back in the same footprint. But because we are also adding beach nourishment and vegetation and all these other, really habitat friendly elements, they typically would offset each other. There's been some new rules recently, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, who handles something called the NOAA calculator, which is what our National Marine Fisheries Organization uses to calculate impacts, did an analysis of the use of beach nourishment. And there was a lot of places where beach nourishment was used as mitigation, and it wasn't being really used in a true and honest way. Like it was being placed in front of structures, and then it was just moving away from the site. So it wasn't really providing mitigation, at least not at that site, for the structure. Well, they've now just gone completely the opposite direction and said, essentially, beach nourishment doesn't really count. So we're hoping to be able to influence that a little bit and convince them that, yes, indeed, it should count. It just needs to be used in the right way. And then just a reminder, there is also, like I said, this very historic lighthouse that we're also working to protect. And so that also makes things a little bit easier in terms of the regulatory environment. And there's some known cultural resources on this site too. I am getting close to my time. I'm going to try to kind of wrap this up with a little bit about stream and estuary restoration, just very briefly. So I mentioned that we were also working at that same site to design an estuary restoration project. These are very complicated projects because there's so many homes between the shoreline and this new estuary, and there's a lot of anxiety about installing a levee and bringing in salt water to what people will say into their backyards. What happens if the levee breaches? Who's going to maintain it? And the county would need to maintain it in this case because it's a county park. So we spent a lot of time talking to stakeholders, educating stakeholders, hopefully getting them to understand the importance of these habitats. It's really been shown that, for juvenile salmonids, these are incredibly important habitats for them to rest and feed and rear before they make their way out to the ocean so that they can have a better chance of survival. So big wide tidal channel with barrier spits is the proposition here. An interior network of tidal channels, and then raising this private road. They won't allow us, it's not their only access, but the homeowners up here don't want it to go away. So raising it, putting in a bridge so that there's a reconnection. There's a stream here that comes into this wetland. And so really reconnecting and having this extensive salt marsh habitat. So this work is continuing. Right now we're moving to work on stormwater solutions. Stormwater doesn't infiltrate because the groundwater levels are very high, which is like a whole nother story and something we've been spending more and more time with sub-consultants working on groundwater flow, what happens before and after restoration in terms of the groundwater itself. I should also mention most of these homes are on septic systems, and so that's one of also their concerns about groundwater. This is a small estuary restoration project that we designed and is actually getting constructed this year, which we're incredibly excited about. There have been very few, if any. I still haven't been able to identify any projects in Puget Sound where there was a historic estuary, pocket estuary, that was completely cut off from tidal influence and has now been reopened. There's several where there was a culvert or a pipe or a tide gate, and there was some kind of tidal influence still getting in, but it was just dampened. It wasn't the full tidal prism. So this could be the first one as far as I know. So it has lots of invasive species that we're dealing with. So it'll be interesting to see how successful we are in getting rid of all this reed canary grass with our tidal influence. And there is a stream that comes in. There's a private bridge, which has actually already been reconstructed and widened. And we'll be constructing barrier spits with lots of wood around this estuary. And this is just another, we also do some work in tidal streams. So a lot of our small streams, people have tried to put them in pipes or ditches, and they're overflowing now. There's just not enough capacity with particularly the intense rain events that we've had in recent years. And they create quite a nuisance. So creates an opportunity. That nuisance sort of creates an opportunity if it's on private land or if it's in a park, a lot of times, to actually have some control over where that water goes. So this is a stream. It's beautifully messy after a big storm event. The wood kind of just went everywhere. We put lots of wood, and when they went out and did sampling for fish, they found a bull trout among other lots of juvenile salmonids and juvenile fish. So was super successful. And we actually did this project in like 6 months. A tribe was a project sponsor, which is one way that we've found that it's much easier to get projects constructed. And we do have a number of tribes in Puget Sound who are sponsoring projects either on their land or sometimes on private land. So that's been a really great avenue and partnership for being able to get projects constructed faster. And so with that, I can take questions. Stop sharing. I can see people. Okay. All right.
Thanks, Jessica, for a great presentation. One question that came to mind, and forgive me if you mentioned it during the presentation, but with regard to, let's say, the design around point no point as an example, was there sea level rise incorporated into that analysis and the design, and kind of what was the magnitude and time horizon you guys were looking at?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, we always incorporate sea level rise. What we have a great actually tool in Puget Sound that was developed that is the relative sea level rise analysis. And so it's taking into account vertical subsidence and uplift of the land and giving us a relative sea level rise projection. We typically recommend using at least the projection to 2050. The problem is in these low-lying communities is that when we look at sea level rise and we look at the elevation that we have to build things to be stable under sea level rise, it's going to be an island, like nothing else around it. Everything else around it could be like 2 feet lower. And so for things like levees, or setback levees, that sort of makes sense because the county's going to have to maintain them and they don't want to rebuild them, right? But for beaches, sometimes it's just not practical. You don't actually have like the backstop to put that sand, right, that high. It's just not going to stay there. I mean, it might just get wind blown, honestly, before the vegetation establishes. So it's a trade-off. So we usually find some kind of, we're going to overbuild it a little bit, but it's probably not going to be totally, it's not going to be totally resistant to sea level rise. Neither are any of those homes. And so we talk about maintenance, right? So then we talked about adaptive management and maintenance. What kind of cycles? What's that going to look like in the long term? How do they place the material without, disturbing all the vegetation, smothering the vegetation? So then it becomes more of that conversation. I can't see everybody. No. Oh, Phil has his hand up. Mm-hmm. Hi, Phil.
Hi, Jessica. Thanks. You've got some pretty neat projects there. This kind of adds on to David's comment and is, you referenced the need for maintenance considerations with these projects, and just curious on how you're approaching that in terms of giving clients some reassurance and confidence about, life cycle of the project, and then what's their willingness to give you the funding that you need to pursue what you need to do in that design, to develop that design basis.
Do you mean in terms of the future design basis or the
no,
design
like
that we're talking about?
If you come up with a project concept and say, okay, we're giving you this soft solution, nature-based solution that has these elements to it, but you give that with the caveat that this is going to require maintenance and monitoring. Mm-hmm. But do they have the confidence then to go ahead with it without knowing what the maintenance requirements are? And then how do you determine the maintenance requirements and give them some reassurance about that over the life cycle? If you're going out to 2050 or 20, whatever it is that they need a solution.
Right. Yeah. So I think one of the big differences down here versus up in BC is that, our regulatory framework is set up such that they don't have a lot of options, right? They have very few options of what they actually can do. So they're eager for any solution, to be honest with you. Even if it's only, we say, well, you're going to have to renourish in 3 to 5 years. I mean, that's not great. We hope, so the Haworth Park example that I showed of the dredge material placement, the estimated lifespan of that was 5 to 8 years. And after 7, it definitely needed renourishment. They haven't actually done it yet. And there's still beach there. It's a park and it's still usable and there's still beach there. But they do need to renourish. One of the biggest hurdles for them, it's not so much the cost of renourishing or adding material, it's the permitting. So we don't have long-term permits and we don't have maintenance permits for beaches. We have them for things like boat ramps, like clearing of sediment on boat ramps, for example, but not for these bigger projects. And so that's really one of their bigger hurdles because they have to go through the whole permitting process again. And it's expensive consultant time, right? There's all kinds of critical area studies that has to be done, all the documentation, and it's just time consuming. So that's probably one of the biggest hurdles for people is like, they're like, oh, I'm going to have to go through this whole permitting process again. So we have a program here that's a multi-agency review where really the state, federal, and not the local, because the local is really under our shoreline management plan. And so that's through the state. So the state people who administer that are all getting together and trying to be the same reviewers for the restoration project. So it's not here and there and everywhere for consistency. And so they're talking about things like, how do we do maintenance? How do we do a maintenance permit? You know, how do we make this less onerous so that this habitat can be maintained? So they're actually surprisingly receptive, and we are really just very honest with people when it comes down to it. You know, we try to be a little bit conservative because we would rather that, you know, we'd rather say it's going to be between 5 and 8. And, you know, if we get to 8, it's like, yay, that's awesome, you know, but you don't know what kind of storm events are going to happen in the next 5 to 8 years. That's the big problem. Like you get another 2022, the year after it's constructed, well, you know, all is lost. Because I think the other thing that we're really upfront about, and this is why we often overnourish, is that the sediment that we're placing is fluffier than the native material. And I know you know this, Phil, but maybe everyone else on the call doesn't, right? So it's going to move faster. And I talked about the compaction, but you know, but then you compact it, and that's also not great either. So it's we like to overnourish, place more material than we think we're going to need. Most of our beaches are starved anyway. So if some of that sediment moves along shore and adds to other people's beaches, usually that's great, not a problem. And it is a question we get from the regulatory agencies, especially the federal fisheries, really wants to know, where's the sediment going to go? How far is it going to go? Is it going to go, you know, offshore and some other SAV? What do you understand this system, and do you understand where the sediment's going to move to? And as long as you can articulate that and you're knowledgeable about it, then they're okay with it. So, yeah.
Good, thank you.
Anyone have any other questions? You can just unmute yourself or pop them in the chat. We have just a couple minutes left. All right, hearing none, we will let everyone get a couple minutes back. Oh, we have one here. Jacqueline, could you consider coastal squeeze as a threat to eelgrass habitats? Eelgrass requires specific depths for photic zone, and with sea level rise, eelgrass needs to shift landward to remain within photic zone, and bed biomass can change.
Yeah, for sure. So I know that there is a lot of discussion about eelgrass and the inability for eelgrass to have the space and the correct substrate, right, to be able to move landward with sea level rise, with the changing climate here in Puget Sound. So I think absolutely yes. We have in Puget Sound, they have something called vital indicators. And so there's different working groups where they're tracking these indicators. And so there's a specific like submerged aquatic vegetation working group. I participate in another one of the working groups because I can't do it all. So I know that is a conversation that they're having. They haven't provided a whole lot of feedback and information to us specifically, but again, we really try hard. We don't place sediment very far out on the beach, to be honest with you. We get a lot of pushback. Like if we're like, oh, we want to place it down to mean low water, they're probably going to say no. Yeah. So if anything, and that's again where sometimes the overnourishing can help a little bit, as long as it's not just going to all go offshore, obviously into eelgrass beds. But if you're placing it higher and you're overnourishing a bit, then again, there's a little bit of sediment to be able to move around, and we'll move down the beach some too in some locations. So it just depends on whether it's cross shore or longshore transport dominated, you know, particular beach that you're working in. But yeah, I think that's a great point in terms of the, you know, the coastal squeeze. Coastal squeeze is squeezing everything, right? Unfortunately, places where people live, all of our habitats. Yeah.
Thanks, Jessica. Oh, one more. Have you worked on any projects where beach nutrition, not sure if there's a better term for that, occurred? For example, adding volumes of oyster shells to a beach. I'd be interested to hear more about this.
I have not worked on any. There's the Coastal Restoration Fund, I think is what they're called, and they're working on oysters. So using oysters placement. I will say that we did a big study of intact barrier embayments or pocket estuaries in Puget Sound in order to develop a tidal channel sizing guideline. And through that, it was actually incredibly interesting. We would spend a day essentially at various estuaries and we found a number of them had this three-dimensional structure that was either oysters or there was one that was dominated by moon snails. They were just everywhere, like just really like crazy colonization of moon snails. And I would say that about those particular estuaries that we were in, their channel seemed to be more stable than it wasn't moving laterally as much as some of the other estuaries that we looked at. So I've sort of conjectured that would be a really interesting like add-on to our project in the future. But we haven't really done any work on that. I could see it coming. Yes, the report is available. I'll send it to Jessica. And I should mention that if you guys are looking for any information, I'll send this out too. Almost everything is everything's publicly available that's paid for by public dollars. And we have it's a little bit clunky to get through, but you can get all the documents through PRISM, the Recreation and Conservation Organization's database. So you can see designs and reports and everything, how much it cost, like everything you want to know about the project. So all these projects that I talked about were all publicly funded. So you could dig around in there. It's got a map. You can click on points and dots. Yeah. And then
Awesome.
Morgan has a comment there.
She's just saying that PSF and DFO are hosting a full-day shoreline armor restoration workshop, including some discussion on regulatory considerations from our DFO colleagues. That sounds awesome. Registration information. Okay, I think that we'll call it there. It's 1 o'clock. We'd like to thank Jessica very much for presenting on behalf of Nature-Based Coastal Solutions Group, and looking forward to potentially seeing Jessica again at the workshop in October.
We'll be there.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you.